Thank you for joining us for episode 3 of our Good Decisions monthly webinar. Today's topic is on the EU AI Act, which just passed or just was approved about 2 weeks ago at this point, and minimal viable governance. These are the must-have capabilities to help protect your enterprise from AI risks. I'm going to kick things off today, and then Dave Trier, our subject matter expert on all things AI governance, is going to share his thoughts on what minimal viable governance is and why it's important. Our agenda is pretty straightforward. We're going to talk about some of the AI risks that we're seeing again and again in the news and talking to C-suite folks at Fortune 500 companies. We're going to do the EU AI, we're going to cover the EU AI Act, a lot of A's in there, in a nutshell, and show you a timeline of when parts of it are estimated to go into effect. And then we're going to dive into MVG, what we're calling minimum viable governance. These are the easy things you can do, or not necessarily easy, but the most straightforward things you can do or have to do to have in place to protect the enterprise from AI risks. And then we'll finish things off with the Q&A. And of course, you can always ask questions in the chat bot. There is a Q&A chat bot. Put your thoughts, ideas, questions in there, and we'll do our best to answer them virtually as they come up. But we'll also try to answer stuff at the end for discussion, make sure we get to as many as we can. With that, let's get rolling. All right. So, Dave and I are fortunate. We get to talk to a lot of AI leaders at Fortune 500 companies, and we're seeing a couple of things. One, certainly like AI is coming up more and more in terms of investment, and FactSet published a chart, and I think we've shared this before on earnings calls. Over 1/3 of S&P earnings calls are stating and talking about AI as a strategic priority, enough so that it's making a material difference in the companies that they feel the need to talk about it in earnings calls. So there's clearly a huge opportunity. You don't need me to tell you guys that. But what we're seeing as we monitor the news is the risks around AI are equally as significant. And we're seeing financial, brand, IP-related issues, regulatory-related issues. Obviously, we're going to talk about the EU AI Act here in a minute. But it's not a question of if AI is going to go wrong. It's a question of when. So how do you prepare yourself? How do you proactively protect the organization going forward as you're making these innovative investments in new technology? So one of the risks that people have questions about, and also just regulations in general, is guidance and oversight of AI. And on March 13th, the EU AI Act was approved by the European Parliament. And so it's a 459-page document. Dave and I have unfortunately spent a lot of time reading it. But here's what you need to know in a nutshell. And again, this is still very early on. The approval just happened a couple of weeks ago, and there's a lot of steps that have to follow. But there's 5 things to really know. One, the purpose of it is to drive responsible innovation, trying to present, we want to prevent the Skynet situation from happening, but also accelerate the use of tools in a way that puts, humans in the middle of it and supports innovation. Number 2, the scope is broad, similar to GDPR. This is extraterritorial. So if you're doing business in the EU, or if you have AI whose outputs are used in the EU, this act is going to apply to your organization. The impacts are significant. The act regulates really the whole AI lifecycle, from development through maintenance and compliance. So there is a lot to think through that's going to affect both the workforce, the employees, and customers of a company. And the consequences are very, very real. There are some serious teeth in the regulation that can affect up to 7% of annual revenue. And this is twice as much as what was in GDPR. So I just want to restate that. This has twice as the consequences of this act, the fines or penalties for not complying, are twice as large as it was for GDPR. And I'm sure many of you went through the GDPR preparation process. It wasn't fun. I went through it myself. There was a lot. It was very stressful. And so just thinking through that, this is a big deal, and the time to pay attention to it is now. And then finally, the act is really centered around a risk-based approach. Not all AI is kind of created equal. The act really does prioritize like the highest risk things is the most important to comply with, and then it kind of goes down from there. But there's really kind of three buckets of risk. There's the unacceptable risk, and this is kind of like the Philip K. Dick Minority Report or Tom Cruise action movie risk that has effects like significant harm with deceptive, exploitive, discriminatory practices. This is stuff like potentially social scoring, folks using facial recognition and other things like that. So I don't think there's not a lot of, let me phrase it this way. Most folks can understand why this would be unacceptable. Then there's the high risk systems. And this is where I think a lot of the regulation is going to be focused on. And this includes critical infrastructure, essential public and private services. So thinking healthcare, banking, for folks in that industry here, this is really something to pay attention to. This is where a lot of the obligations are going to come in for the folks on this call. And then there's limited and minimal risk, systems that aren't necessarily going to drive, systemic risk, like, simple chatbots or kind of things like that. So that's it in a nutshell. Again, there's a lot more to dig in, and things may change going forward, but these are the 5 key things to know. All right. And then here's the timeline. Unfortunately, the act, as you read it, there's a lot of different dates in there and when things go into effect. So I've tried to simplify it, and I know this is a bit of an eye chart, but here are the couple key things to know. And again, this is all subject to change. So the act was approved by European Parliament on March 13th, so about 2 weeks ago. It's expected to go through a final proofread and a formal endorsement in the beginning of June, which I think is just before some of the European parliamentary elections. But again, that's subject to change. And then once it is formally endorsed and is published, it will go into force in 20 days from them. So estimating about the beginning of July. And then from that date, you can start planning of like, all right, what are the key things that I need to really concern myself with? I think the first thing is number one, 6 months after that goes into force, there's going to be prohibitions on the unacceptable risk AI systems that are out there. Some of the things like social scoring we talked about. And then the next thing is in about a year from now, in July 2025 or a year from then, obligations on providers of general purpose AI, the provisions on penalties go into effect. And so those are things to pay attention to. And then another year from then, the obligations on complying with the high risk complying with the obligations that apply to the high risk systems will go into effect. So those are really kind of the 3 areas to focus on. And so it leads to a question of, all right, how can I best set up my organization quickly to prepare for all of that? And before I turn it over to Dave, one of the things we talk about with different stakeholders is who is accountable for the AI risks in an organization. And so I'd love to do a poll just right now of, and Sarah, if you can put that poll up, who in the C-suite of your organization is responsible for the AI risks within your organization? So there's a couple different answers there. If you don't know, you can answer don't know, but I really want to try to understand who you believe in your organization is accountable for AI risk, the singular person. We'll keep this open. I'll let it sit on the screen for a couple more seconds. We'll keep the poll open as I turn it over to Dave, but please share your thoughts on that. We'd love to get a picture of how the risks roll up in the organization. All right, Dave, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Jay. And as Jay mentioned, and everybody on this call knows, that there's such a massive opportunity around AI. But how do you make sure that you are able to capitalize on this, but still safeguard the organization from the brand, reputation, and regulatory risk, especially in light of the EU AI Act that was just approved, as Jay mentioned? And so this is where, after talking with really hundreds of executives and practitioners, that came across this concept that I put forward, which is minimum viable governance. So what is the right level of initial governance that we should be doing to get started to safely adopt and use AI? Because we don't want to slow down innovation, right? But we want to make sure we're protecting the organization. So how do I get started? And again, this is that concept of minimal viable governance that we'll talk about today. So with that, we're going to talk through a couple, three key elements of minimum viable governance. And as we go through each of those three, we'll talk about the requirements that we're seeing from regulatory, such as the EU AI Act. We'll talk about what are some of the key capabilities or really requirements that are needed as part of the regulations in this model minimal viable governance, but also the challenges to actually achieving those. And then finally, we'll talk about some of the pitfalls that we've already seen to date around this, but more importantly, the practical steps to get started with this MVG overall. All right, so with that, let's dive into the first one. And I wanted to preface this first key element of MVG, which is you can't govern what you don't see. It's very difficult to have any level of governance if you don't have visibility into where AI and ML is actually being used across the organization. So this first MVG element is really around visibility and an inventory. So if we go to the next slide, Jay, what we're going to, again, start with is what are some of the requirements that we're seeing from the regulations? Obviously, we're going to highlight the EU AI Act since that's so fresh, March 13th of this year. But the first one, again, around inventory, if you go back, really around inventory is, as you see a couple of excerpts from the EU AI Act, is really to identify where AI is being used. And the EU AI Act takes that risk-based approach, as Jay mentioned before, to identify, is this a unacceptable use? Is this high risk? Or is this limited or minimal risk? So organizations, as they're leafing through the couple hundred-page EU AI Act, but also all the other regulations, need to get started. The minimum viable governance to get started is to identify where these AI systems are being used and to identify the risk around those. Now, part of that MVG, as you can see in this requirements here, is especially for the higher risk systems, you need to have specific management and auditability around those specific AI systems. So what the data systems are used, what's the scope, what's the approved limitations and risks around those, what's the technical documentation, what's the transparency, all of those need to be cataloged as part of the inventory. But again, this is not just the EU AI Act. All of the similar regulations, whether it be in the US at the state level, the federal level, as well as what you see in EU and Singapore and other places, have this similar place that you get started. And that's why it's the first element of MVG. Understand and put into an inventory the AI systems and the appropriate accountability, scope, limitations, documentation, etc. So let's go to the next one. And some of the challenges that we've seen in trying to get moving on this first capability or this first element of MVG is that, well, the variety of technologies, of AI technologies out there. You have internally developed technologies. You have potentially vendor products that you've purchased that have AI, whether that's a ChatGPT or some other vendor, whether it's a FICO, et cetera. And then you have embedded AI, which is every software system out there today has AI that's now embedded. Whether it's a Salesforce or in the healthcare space, it's an Epic or a Cerner, there's embedded AI. So how do you keep pace with the variety of different AI technologies? But then the velocity of changes behind those are constantly being updated, as well as the regulations are constantly evolving, as we've seen with the EU AI just being approved. But luckily, there's a set of themes, common capabilities you see on the right-hand side that's pervasive across these different regulations. And that's where, again, the first element is that governance inventory to track across all those different type of technologies. What's the purpose and usage? What's the accountability? Who is accountable from a business, an IT, a risk, a legal perspective? What data is being used for, whether it's you're internally developed and you're training it or using it for testing or that sort of holdout type data? What are the technical assets, the documentation, the approvals, the test results? So these are some common themes that you'll see not only in the EU AI for the high risk systems, but also in other regulations. So if you go to the next one, with those challenges in mind, we've seen organizations step into some real pitfalls, right? We've seen over and over again, where especially large organizations think, oh, okay, well, it's an inventory. That's straightforward. We can do that, right? We just need to capture this information. We probably put it in a spreadsheet and we should be in good shape. But if you think back to the challenges, you have such that variety of different technologies, and it's no longer just the central data science or the central analytics team that is doing this. Now you have back office, you have finance, you have marketing, you have all these different teams that are actually using AI, using different technologies, different teams. They weren't grounded in some of the good governance practices that, say, maybe the central analytics team were. And so now you're exposing yourself to those risks that we mentioned before. So how do you keep pace with all the technologies and all the regulations across all the different departments and teams? And that's where, again, we call it the MVG way, the minimum viable governance way, is really puts forward how to do this using a dynamic inventory approach. So it's no longer let's manually reach out to everybody. Let's try to track this in spreadsheets. Let's try to keep pace with all the different technologies, but rather using a dynamic approach where you're constantly reaching out to the various systems that are being used, reaching out to the various embedded AI systems to keep that information up to date. So you shift from this very manual approach, which is very difficult to keep pace, very costly, to be frank, to keep up with the changes, to one where that is constantly managed. And as part of that, different vendors have best practices that are baked in to allow for that inventory to have the necessary elements that we talked about on that previous slide. The third part, as part of this dynamic inventory, though, is just having a couple simple integrations in place so that you're streamlining the process. If you remember at the outset, what I talked about is we want to make sure we have the right level of governance, but we can't slow down innovation. So by having this dynamic approach, by having a couple simple integrations that are pulling in the necessary information for you automatically, that's when you can move to a more scalable, robust approach that gives you the right level of governance, the MVG governance, but doesn't slow down innovation. So if we go to the next one, just a kind of a look at what this might appear. This is our product. So we are a product company, and we have helped many large enterprises to implement a proper AI governance approach that's scalable and doesn't slow innovation. This is just a view into a very simple, let's get started. The crawl, walk, run analogy. Let's get started with the crawl of just getting visibility into all the different AI use cases across the organization, what teams are using, what's that risk tiering, and where they are in their process. Are we still in development, experimenting stage, as well as those that are in production? But finally, kind of most importantly is, have we checked all the boxes? Have we done everything that was needed in that inventory perspective, the items I called out in the EU AI Act? And what does that look like from a completion and adherence perspective? So again, just a little bit of a view into what's possible for rolling out an MVG approach in a more streamlined fashion. This moves us to our second MVG principle, which is around light controls. We obviously want to trust everybody in the organization, but it's governance, right? So we want to make sure that we trust but verify. So let's take a look about what that means. That second MVG element, if you go to the next slide, is around having the right set of light controls. And what that means is, calling back to the EU AI Act here, is that we have, first and foremost, one of the things that is paramount throughout and pervasive throughout the EU AI Act is transparency. Transparency into the AI systems that are being developed, that are being used, that there's transparency for end users for which they may need to know, they should know that they're interacting with an AI system. But additional sets of controls that they call out, especially for the high-risk type systems, are having the appropriate and comprehensive level of testing for robustness, for safety, for ethical fairness, as well as for privacy and data governance as a whole. This is the EU AI Act, but this is, again, pervasive in other regulations, is having a minimal set of controls in place to make sure that we are transparent, reliable, robust, and not in any way biased as part of it. So let's run into the next one. Some of the common challenges, it's the same theme, right? That these large organizations are using this combination of internally developed and vendor and embedded models and that pace of change. So how do I make sure that whether it's using a ChatGPT or it's using an internally developed Python model or it's using a off-the-shelf software that has embedded AI, how do I make sure that those same principles, those same controls are being used? Well, this is where it gets into those common themes on the right-hand side. that, yes, that's a very long regulation and there's many of them, but there's common themes. As I mentioned before, transparency of not only the use case and the usage of it, but transparency into what data was used, transparency in the technical assets around it, documentation, comprehensive testing is one that is often forgot, especially for vendor and embedded models. And I'll talk a little bit more about why that's so important in a second. But all of these are the types of light controls that you can put into place early on in order to make sure that you are adhering to not only the EU AI Act, but also the regulations that have been pervasive throughout the US and at the global level. So if you go to the next one, some of the common pitfalls around this, as I mentioned before, is that organizations, easy problem to solve, right? That we can just track this in a spreadsheet and really just trust our different employees or different members of the organization to do the right thing. That's fair, and that can go so far. But now, as I mentioned before, because these AI systems are so pervasive in terms of marketing, back office, supply chain, that you need a more systematic way to enforce those. And this is where automation really comes into play and really can help, where automation can ensure that no matter what type of AI technology is used, no matter what comes in the regulation, that you're actually enforcing every step in the policy. And this is something where vendors such as ModelUp have invested years and years of time and intellectual property, as well as experience helping large organizations to deliver on this. So leverage those best practices. If you go to the next one, what this actually can look like is that you go from I don't know where models are, to, well, I don't know where if AI systems are complying with the regulations, to, all right, I need to know exactly what I need to do, what open items I have, what open risks I have, and then where am I in terms of applying those light set of controls across the organization, again, across all teams, across all technologies, etc. So let's move into the final area, the final element of MVG. And if we look at this is how at an executive level, I started with the two questions that we hear all the time at the C level, as well as out to the board of directors, is how am I using AI? And then how am I safeguarding the organization? So how do you report that back up to the executives to make sure that they're making the right decisions from a business, financial, regulatory, and risk perspective? Well, this is where element number 3 comes in around reporting. We call back to the EU AI Act here. There's a couple of elements that are called out, especially for high-risk systems, that in the top one there, they talk about, well, high-risk systems need to ensure that you have ongoing monitoring of the operations, post-market monitoring. But this is for both the developers of generative AI as well as those that are using, say, generative AI. So making sure that you're continually and constantly monitoring to make sure that they are actually providing the results you expected, they're robust, stable, and ethically fair. The bottom piece, which is specific to the EU AI Act, is that they will be developing a central registration system for all high-risk AI systems. So even for organizations, you say, I'm not a developer of an LLM as an example, but you then use that for, say, healthcare decisions or hiring decisions. That actually is classified as a high-risk system in the eyes of the EU AI Act. And therefore, you'll need to register those types of high-risk systems as well as do ongoing monitoring and reporting. So some of the next one, the challenges, is that we move into same thing, velocity of change, the technologies used. So how do you report on those usage and risks across the organizations? Common themes on the right-hand side around reporting, that as part of the EU AI Act and many others, is that you need to have that inventory at the executive level to report up all your systems by the risk tiering, location, and ownership. You need to be able to identify where you have high priority risks that need to be mitigated. And you need regular updates on, well, what's the usage of these? What's the performance around those? And potentially, as with the EU AI Act, need to actually regularly report on the high-risk type systems. If you go to the final one here, pitfalls around this, manual reporting. I've seen time and time again where manual reporting is attempted across the different teams. And what happens is that you have missed AI usage, you have inconsistent reporting. And actually, the most important one is that you have unknown risks around this. So you don't know where there are potential risks that need to be mitigated and really dealt with at a senior level. So the MVG way, as we've talked about, is, well, actually, if you've done the first two tenets that we just talked about, reporting actually comes easy. because then you can rely on that inventory, you can rely on that automation doing some automated testing, et cetera, to actually supply the necessary reports as well as the KPIs and KRIs. But it is important for executives really to align on what are those top level KPIs and KRIs that we need to use to manage how we use AI across the organization, and then enforce that policy at a top-down level approach. If you look at the next one, just again, a representation of how we've helped customers do this in the past. This is obviously a very simplified view, but you're able to use the built-in automation with the metrics to get automated performance testing, ethical fairness testing, robustness. All of those can be run on an automated basis. You can run them against the thresholds that you've been set from a risk tolerance perspective, and you can report those back into the executive level in a consistent manner so that you can understand what's being used, where do I have risks, and are those risks being mitigated overall. So we ran through this pretty quickly, but hopefully that gives a little bit of sense of, yes, governance in a couple 100-page regulatory document can seem overwhelming. But if you take an MVG approach, you can break it down into a couple of steps that help you get going very quickly: inventory, light controls, and reporting. So with that, I'll hand it back to Jay to take us forward, to wrap up and to answer some questions.
Yeah, we've got quite a few questions, which is great. We're going to answer a couple of those. We're also going to do one more poll question. There's obviously a lot of investment in AI, but we're curious to what level you guys are thinking about investment in AI governance as well. So Sarah, if you could put up the next poll question, and as we do the Q&A here, if you guys can fill that out, that'd be wonderful. All right, so we got really kind of 4 buckets of questions here. So the first one I want to ask Dave is, what's the best strategy for managing third-party and embedded AI risk? Because this is definitely something that does come up in the EU AI Act.
Yeah, absolutely. So that's a great question, first off. And where it comes down to it, that you need to manage it in the same approach, meaning that you need to capture the usage of it, the limitations, what it's the approved usage is, as well as you need to capture any sort of assets, whether you're providing data to the vendor that may be using that particular, maybe using your data to do a customized version of it. So you need to be able to capture all those key elements from an inventory perspective. The controls are a little bit lighter, as you can imagine, because it's not internally developed, but you still need to go through the series of verifications, comprehensive testing on how you're using that vendor in your specific usage scenario, and then certainly documentation and reporting. So all of those pieces still apply even for third-party models.
Nice. And yeah, the MRM folks are pretty active in the chat. So kind of the theme of the question is, what's the difference between governance and MRM, or what's the role of MRM in managing AI risk, and what's the difference between model risk and AI risk? Are they the same thing? Can you give some insight into that?
Yeah, so thanks for those questions. So yes, a lot of these are principles that have been around in the financial sector, especially in the US and certainly globally, from a model risk management perspective. So these are some of the same principles. What's a little bit different with AI is that you have, again, first and foremost, a variety of different technologies, and inclusive of more embedded AI being a new concept, whereas that's not something that's typically been used within the financials. So you have a more variety of different technologies, and then you have the constant pace of change around it. So yes, most large financials have adapted or adopted, evolved, if you will, their MRM capabilities, but ultimately those are some of the shifts that are seen from an AI perspective. Now, there's other kind of overarching governance. If you think about it, there's the data governance that's related. There's a security as well. Those are things that typically don't fall under an MRM type view, if you will.
And then a couple more questions. I know we're at time, but for folks that can stick around, we're going to try to answer a few more here. How do you determine a risk tier? I know that's a broad question, but maybe you can offer some guiding principles there.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is certainly within the financial sector, they've had determinations around risk tiering for quite a while. That's generally based on the materiality and the impact, the exposure to it, if you will. Within healthcare, actually, there's publications within the U.S. The FDA has proposed specific risk tiering around, which is really the impact of the health situation, and also what's involved in it, if it's used for actually driving clinical decisions, or it's just used for more clinical management. So that risk tiering really does vary based on the vertical, but it really comes back into the impact should AI go wrong, and really the probability of that actually occurring.
And last question that I see here, and I'm actually not sure on this one. So is there a requirement to understand and disclose the carbon impact of AI solutions in the EU AI Act too? Because obviously it's very computationally expensive to run these models and systems.
Yeah, good question. I think that's Fiona. Great question. So first off, Jay and I are not lawyers, so just to kind of the disclosure that we are not lawyers, so please don't take this as legal advice or counsel. But there is reference within the EU AI Act, mainly for the developers or providers, as they call it, of AI. So you think about those that are actually developing generative AI solutions, LLMs, et cetera. So there is specific clauses around carbon impact for those. So I wanted to point that out. But there is, in terms of the actual users, or as they say, deployers of different AI, that one I'm not certain about. But I definitely know the providers do have a requirement around carbon impact. Great question. But please, again, refer to your legal counsel. We are not lawyers.
Yes, definitely. And then here's another one, and I think kind of related to the poll question a little bit. For companies without a CDO, do you see MRM or AI risk management falling under the umbrella of a GRC function, legal, audit, compliance? And I think a lot of this is evolving. So, Dave, I don't know what your thoughts are on this.
Yeah, that's the right answer. It's evolving. So we have seen that some companies actually have assigned a chief AI officer, under which the AI governance, basically the buck stops with the chief AI officer. That's inclusive of what's being done on the innovation side as well on the governance side. For those that haven't moved towards that sort of paradigm, it varies. We've seen it fall to a CDO, CDAO, or moving up, or falling under the chief risk officer and MRM as part of it. So unfortunately, it varies, and that's where we hopefully would see something where there is at least one C-suite member that's accountable for any AI usage.
Nice. And last question. I love all the questions, guys. Thank you. This is a really interesting one, so I want to ask it. How do you draw a line between artificial intelligence versus non-artificial intelligence models? What's the difference? And that's a really good question.
Yeah, and honestly, this was what took the EU AI Act creators a long time to figure out, because they had to come to a definition that would essentially stand the test of time, to be honest. So there's a very specific definition that the EU AI Act put in there. But at the end of the day, it's where there are a set of inputs that have a probabilistic output. That's not something that can be deterministic, meaning that can always have the same answer. It's based on the inputs. That's the most generic version, but we're very happy to send you the specific excerpt, because again, we're not lawyers. We want to make sure that you have the correct and legal definition of it. But ultimately, that's something that the EU AI Act took a lot of time to define what that was. But I think that was when, we'd be happy to send you this specific excerpt.
Yep. Yeah, it's in chapter 1 of the Act. So, and we have links to it in the presentation here. All right. So thank you guys for all the questions. Great participation. I know we moved through this really quickly. But if you have any other further questions, you can always reach out to us. Either visit our website or reach out to us at sales@ModelUp. We're happy to talk more into your individual needs, challenges, and answer all sorts of questions. So please, please, please don't hesitate to reach out. And then we are going to do this again next month. So register for episode 4. It's going to be about accountability for AI risks, because we know that's looking at the poll questions, it's still very much an open question. So please join us next month at the end of April. We'd love to see you there. And of course, thank you for taking the time today. We really appreciate getting everybody together and learning and talking to y'all. Have a great rest of the week, and hope to see you next month. Bye-bye.